And we have new information in the case of a 5-year-old girl found dead in Aurora. We want to warn you, the new details in this story are graphic.
Court documents say police found burned human remains at an apartment, and they explain why the mother is now facing charges. Here with more is investigative reporter Jeremy Hahola.
Investigators don't know exactly what happened yet to 5-year-old Maha Li Hobbs, who was listed as missing earlier this week. But police say they strongly believe the remains of a child found.
She told the police her daughter had been adopted, that she was in a better place with a new family. It was a claim meant to bring closure, but instead it raised questions, the kind of questions that make your stomach turn. Three weeks of silence. A grandmother, desperate for answers. A mother, sending cryptic text messages and avoiding calls. And when officers finally stepped into that Aurora apartment, they uncovered something no one was prepared for. Inside a utility closet, charred remains. In the fireplace, fragments of bone. The truth wasn't just horrifying. It was nearly unthinkable. What could drive a parent to this? How does someone go from rocking a child to sleep to hiding her body inside the very place they once called home? This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about neglect, missed signs, and a system that never got the chance to intervene. And it's about the one person who refused to stop asking questions until the truth came out. Stay with me, because what happened to 5-year-old Maha Li Hobbs will stay with you long after the story ends. And tell me, what do you think a parent's breaking point looks like? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maha Li Hobbs was just 5 years old, a bright, curious little girl living in Aurora, Colorado, whose short life, until then, had unfolded quietly. She was too young to understand the weight of the world around her, too innocent to sense what was coming. There were no headlines bearing her name, no flashing alerts or missing posters. But someone noticed her absence. Someone who couldn't ignore the silence. It was late May 2023 when a woman living hundreds of miles away began to feel something wasn't right. Alexus Tanielle Nelson's mother, Maha Li's grandmother, hadn't seen or heard from her granddaughter in weeks. Phone calls went unanswered. Video chats, once regular, had stopped entirely. There were no birthday updates, no casual mentions of her playing or watching cartoons. Just silence. And when Alexus finally responded to her mother's messages, the replies weren't comforting. They were unsettling. The text came through sporadically, disjointed, evasive, laced with a strange tone. Alexus claimed she had given Maha Li up for adoption. No explanation, no photos, no details about the family who supposedly now cared for the little girl. When pressed, she didn't say where the child had gone or who had taken her in, just that she was no longer there. Her mother grew increasingly alarmed. Nothing about Alexus's messages felt right. Not the words, not the tone, not the timing. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. On May 30th, she made the call. She contacted the Aurora Police Department and asked for a welfare check. She told them she hadn't seen her granddaughter in nearly 3 weeks. She voiced her concerns about the messages. How they didn't make sense. How Alexus wasn't being truthful. She begged them to go to her daughter's apartment and find out what was going on. That call set everything in motion. Officers were dispatched to the 1000 block of South Elkhart Way. When officers arrived at Alexus Tanielle Nelson's apartment, they had a clear task. Check on the welfare of a 5-year-old girl, whose whereabouts were now uncertain. What they encountered instead was a mother with answers that didn't satisfy even the most basic questions. Alexus stood in the doorway, poised and unbothered. She told them that her daughter, Maha Li, had been adopted. The words came easily, but they carried no warmth, no sense of relief, no mention of how difficult the decision had been. Just a flat declaration. She's gone. She's with someone else now. Naturally, the officers asked for more. What agency handled the adoption? When did it happen? Who took custody? But Alexus offered no names, no papers, no court filings. She didn't even remember the agency clearly, only saying it was somewhere local. When pressed, she gave a vague name, one investigators would later find had never handled any case involving her or Maha Li. Her story unraveled quickly, not because of what she said, but because of what she couldn't say. Still, there was no immediate arrest. At that moment, the officers had no body, no official missing persons report, and no hard evidence of wrongdoing. Just a mother who seemed evasive and a grandmother's long-distance plea for help. It wasn't enough to detain her yet, but suspicions had taken root. The absence of documentation alone raised alarm bells. Adoption is a legal process. There are forms, approvals, court dates, records. There's always a paper trail. But here there was none. That night, behind closed doors, investigators began looking deeper. They contacted child welfare agencies. They ran searches for any adoption filings involving Alexus Nelson. Every inquiry led to a dead end. No one had taken in a child named Maha Li Hobbs. No agency had worked with her mother. No court had processed her case. And so, a welfare check escalated into something far more urgent. Detectives returned to their department with more questions than answers. Alexis's calm demeanor now felt more like concealment than composure. Her story about adoption had holes you could see through from miles away. And somewhere in that apartment, off limits to them for now, might be the truth they feared. Do you think the police should have arrested her right then? Based on her lies, her evasion, the missing paperwork? Let us know in the comments. The following morning, investigators came back, but this time, they weren't knocking. They had a search warrant in hand and a growing sense that something unspeakable had happened inside that apartment. With legal access granted, detectives began a careful, methodical sweep of the unit. Every corner, every drawer, every hidden space became a potential site of evidence. The apartment itself was modest, but what they were about to uncover would transform this quiet space into the epicenter of one of Aurora's most disturbing crimes. It didn't take long. On the apartment's patio, inside a utility closet, they found a bag, heavy, burned, sealed shut. As they opened it, the air shifted. Inside were charred human remains, small, fragile, reduced to almost nothing. The kind of discovery that silences a room, even for seasoned investigators. But that wasn't all. Inside the apartment, they turned to the fireplace. Something about it didn't sit right. When they sifted through the ash and soot, they found fragments, bone fragments. Not wood, not debris, bone. The remains of someone far too young. Forensics began immediately. The question everyone already feared to ask now demanded an answer. Was it her? Was this 5-year-old Maha Li? DNA analysis confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The remains belonged to the little girl who was supposed to have been adopted. The child her mother claimed was safe, living with strangers. She had never left the apartment. The walls that once echoed with the sounds of a child now held only the residue of something terrible. For detectives, the weight of the discovery was immense. They weren't just solving a case. They were confronting a horror. A child had died. Her remains had been hidden, burned, and left in places where no one should ever be found. And still, the questions hung in the air. How did it come to this? Were there signs? Could this have been stopped? Could this have been prevented? What do you think? Could someone have stepped in before it was too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The moment the remains were discovered, everything changed. There was no room left for speculation. No more guessing games. Alexus Tanielle Nelson was taken into custody. The first charge? Attempting to influence public servant. A legal way of saying she lied to police in an effort to obstruct the truth. Her story of adoption, once just suspicious, was now fully exposed as a fabrication. She hadn't simply misled her mother or offered a vague excuse out of panic. She had deliberately and repeatedly tried to convince law enforcement that her daughter no longer lived with her, that she had legally transferred custody. But there were no legal filings, no agencies with her name in the system. The entire adoption claim was fiction, designed to shield herself from what was already unfolding inside that apartment. As Alexus sat in an interrogation room, the investigation continued. The bag of remains and the fireplace fragments were sent for forensic analysis. Each test brought more clarity and more confirmation of what had really happened. The bones, the burn patterns, the condition of the tissue, all told a story her words had tried to bury. And none of it matched the calm, collected narrative she had offered just days before. Forensics didn't just confirm the remains belonged to Maha Li. They established intent. The attempt to incinerate a body, the concealment in a utility closet, and the lengths taken to erase evidence painted a grim picture. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't someone overwhelmed and unsure what to do. This was deliberate, measured, and cruel. The walls of deception Alexus built began to collapse, one by one. Investigators traced her digital footprint, her text messages, her online activity, and her personal history. Every piece pulled in only one direction. She had lied to her family, to the police, and ultimately to herself. As the charges began to mount, so did the public's questions. Who was Alexus Tanielle Nelson? What brought her to this point? And why would her mother choose this path over countless others? The search for answers was just beginning. To understand the horror of what happened, we must first look at the woman at the center of it all, Alexus Tanielle Nelson. On the surface, Alexus appeared to be a mother in a situation that spiraled out of control. But to truly understand why someone would commit such a monstrous act, we need to peer deeper into her past. What drove her to this? What, if anything, in her background could offer clues to the actions that led to the tragic death of her daughter? Alexus was a woman with a history that wasn't always clear, but certain pieces of her life began to emerge as the investigation unfolded. There were reports of an unstable past, including challenges with mental health. She had struggled with periods of depression and emotional instability. Though specific diagnoses remained unclear in the early stages of the case. Mental health issues are often complex and multifaceted, and they didn't always align with the outward image she portrayed of being in control. For Alexus, the pressures of life seemed to have mounted over time. Family dynamics were also under scrutiny. Her relationship with her own parents appeared strained, and it became evident that her connection with Maha Li was fraught with tension and inconsistency. Neighbors and acquaintances described Alexus as someone who often withdrew from the support systems around her, keeping people at arm's length. It wasn't hard to see that she carried a weight, a heaviness that might have made it difficult to share her struggles with those closest to her. Additionally, there are indications of previous concerns about her ability to care for Maha Li. While no formal reports had been filed that would have prompted immediate intervention, there were whispers in the community about her parenting. A child, no matter their age, should be safe, nurtured, and cared for. But Alexus's behavior raised questions about whether she had the capacity to provide that for her young daughter. As investigators dug deeper, they learned of the strain Alexus had been under: financial struggles, personal loss, isolation, and perhaps most telling, her fear of judgment. In the end, it seemed she saw herself trapped in a corner. The story she had told herself and others, the story of a child she could no longer care for and had given up for adoption, became the escape route. The burden of her life, of being a mother in distress, was too much to bear. And in that desperate attempt to hold on to something, anything, she chose a path of destruction instead. But no explanation can justify the death of an innocent child. As horrific as her circumstances might have been, they didn't erase the fact that Maha Li's life was stolen before it had even truly begun. Trauma, isolation, mental health issues. Can they ever justify actions like these? Can the weight of past experiences explain the unexplainable? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the case against Alexus Tanielle Nelson moved into the courtroom, the world watched with bated breath, hoping for justice, but dreading what the proceedings would reveal. What had begun as a heartbreaking mystery soon turned into a deeply painful legal battle, one that would ultimately lay bare the full extent of the tragedy and force those closest to the case to confront the unimaginable. The timeline of the court proceedings unfolded over the course of several months, each day bringing with it more heartache and revelation. In June 2024, Alexus pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, and attempting to influence a public servant. But the pain of this admission was not the end. It was only the beginning. The courtroom became a stage for the unraveling of an even deeper tragedy. The prosecution made a powerful case, presenting evidence that not only underscored Alexus's horrific actions, but also painted a chilling portrait of a mother who had chosen cruelty over compassion. They argued that Alexus had ample opportunities to seek help for her daughter, to place her in the care of others, or to find support. But instead, she resorted to a lie, fabricating a story about an adoption that was never real, and eventually murdering Maha Li in a callous and deliberate act of violence. Key witnesses, including family members and law enforcement officials, took a stand, their testimonies adding weight to the already overwhelming case. The details were harrowing. One by one, they described the shocking discoveries made in Alexus's apartment, the frantic search for the truth, and the devastation that followed. Law enforcement officers shared their chilling accounts of what they found in the apartment, the remains of bone fragments, the eerie calm with which Alexus had woven her web of lies. These witnesses spoke not only to the facts of the case, but to the emotional toll it had taken on everyone involved, from the detectives who had uncovered the truth to the family members who could barely comprehend the gravity of what had transpired. Then came the emotional reactions from those who had been closest to Maha Li, including her grandmother, who had been the first to raise the alarm. As she took the stand, the pain was palpable, her voice shaking as she recounted the horror of losing her beloved granddaughter in such an unimaginable way. The courtroom was heavy with grief as the true magnitude of the loss sank in. It was no longer just a legal case. It was a raw, emotional outpouring of sorrow, frustration, and helplessness. Family members, unable to contain their emotions, wept openly as they described what Maha Li's death had done to them, how it had shattered their hearts and forever altered their lives. Through it all, the prosecution's argument remained clear. Alexus had taken a life, not because she couldn't find help, but because, in her twisted desperation, she chose a path of violence and deception. She had not just failed as a mother. She had taken her own child's future and ripped it away. As the trial neared its conclusion, the judge prepared to pass sentence. Alexus faced a range of charges, and the weight of those charges would soon fall on her in the form of a sentence that would aim to balance justice for the young life she destroyed. But as the judge prepared to make his decision, one question lingered in the minds of many. What kind of sentence could possibly bring justice for a child who had suffered so much? What would you have done if you were the judge? What sentence would you have given to Alexus Tanielle Nelson? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The day of sentencing arrived with an air of inevitability. After months of legal battles, painful revelations, and courtroom drama, Alexus Tanielle Nelson faced the consequences of her actions. Her guilty plea was not a path to redemption, but an acknowledgement of the horrific choices she had made. In June 2024, Alexus pled guilty to multiple charges, each one reflecting the severity of her actions. The charge that stood above all was second-degree murder, for taking the life of her 5-year-old daughter. Alexus was sentenced to 48 years in prison. It was a sentence that sought to hold her accountable for the brutal and senseless murder of Maha Li Hobbs, a young life snuffed out far too soon. The weight of this sentence was impossible to ignore. A mother had killed her child. The act was unforgivable in its cruelty, and the consequences reflected that truth. In addition to the murder charge, Alexus was sentenced to 24 years for tampering with the deceased body. This charge underscored the calculated nature of her actions. She had not only taken her daughter's life, but she had also attempted to conceal it in the most grotesque manner, burning the remains, hiding them in a utility closet, and fabricating a story to cover her tracks. Each decision made in the aftermath of Maha Li's death showed a chilling disregard for the life she had taken. The third charge, influencing a public servant, carried a 12-year sentence. This charge highlighted Alexus's attempt to manipulate law enforcement with her false adoption story. She had gone to great lengths to obstruct justice, attempting to create a narrative that would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But the truth, no matter how much she tried to suppress it, had been uncovered. All of these sentences were to be served consecutively, meaning Alexus would serve each one after the other. The total amount of time, 84 years, was a staggering reflection of the brutality of her crimes. It was a sentence meant not only to punish, but to ensure that Alexus Tanielle Nelson would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. Judge Joseph Whitfield, who had presided over the case, delivered a statement that encapsulated the horror and heartbreak of the situation. There are no words that can truly describe the pain and devastation caused by the loss of a child, the judge said, his voice steady but filled with gravity. This sentence is meant to reflect the gravity of the crime and to ensure that no other child will suffer at the hands of this defendant. The loss of young Maha Li will never be forgotten, and justice in this case is not just a sentence. It is a solemn reminder of what has been lost. As the judge pronounced the sentence, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. For Maha Li's family, it was a bittersweet moment. No sentence could ever bring their precious child back, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward making sure that the terrible actions of Alexus Tanielle Nelson would never be repeated. And for the community and the world watching, it was a stark reminder of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, the innocent, the vulnerable, and the children whose lives should be filled with love, not with fear. In the end, the 84 years were not just a sentence for Alexus. They were a symbol of the loss of Maha Li and a powerful message that no matter how much a mother may suffer or struggle, no excuse could justify such an incomprehensible act of violence. The sentencing of Alexus Tanielle Nelson reverberated far beyond the courtroom. As the final gavel came down, it triggered a cascade of reactions from the public, officials, and the community. The weight of the tragedy was felt deeply by many, especially those who had followed the case from the beginning. District Attorney John Kellner, who had been at the forefront of the prosecution, spoke out with a clarity that reflected the gravity of the case. Kellner's response was unequivocal. "This case is a heartbreaking reminder of the importance of protecting our children," he said. "The law provides clear and compassionate avenues for parents who are unable to care for their children, avenues that could have prevented this tragedy." His statement was a powerful condemnation of Alexus's actions, emphasizing that while life can be difficult, no circumstance could justify the murder of a child. Kellner's words were more than just a reflection of his professional role. They were a call to action for society to do better in supporting at-risk families and ensuring the safety of vulnerable children. Kathleen Tierney, the senior deputy district attorney, also weighed in on the case. Her comments focused on the misuse of adoption claims, a central element of the deception that had surrounded Maha Li's disappearance. There are legal and compassionate ways for parents who cannot care for their children to surrender them safely, she stated. To fabricate an adoption story and then murder your own child is not only morally reprehensible, it is a violation of the trust placed in our legal systems to protect those who need it most. Tierney's words resonated with many who had been horrified by the false narrative Alexus had spun in an attempt to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. Media coverage of the case intensified in the wake of the sentencing. News outlets across the country reported on the chilling details, from the discovery of Maha Li's remains to the courtroom drama that had unfolded over the course of the trial. The story struck a nerve with viewers and readers alike, and public outrage was swift and widespread. Comment sections and social media platforms were flooded with expressions of disbelief, anger, and sadness. People couldn't fathom how a mother could be capable of such a heinous act. The case sparked conversations about child welfare, the importance of reporting suspicions, and the need for greater resources to support parents in distress before situations like this could escalate to violence. The public's response was not just one of outrage, but of reflection. This case became a rallying point for many who sought to better understand how such a tragedy could happen and, more importantly, what could be done to prevent future occurrences. Child advocacy groups and welfare organizations began to see an uptick in support and donations as people, moved by the tragedy, took action in memory of Maha Li. Communities held vigils to honor her life and raise awareness about the importance of child protection. In Aurora, the case also left a lasting impact on the local community. Neighbors who had once shared a sense of normalcy with Alexus struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the woman now revealed as a murderer. The case served as a harsh wake-up call, underscoring the need for vigilance and open conversations about the safety of children in their homes and communities. As the media spotlight shifted away, the impact of the case remained. The conversations it sparked were not fleeting. People continued to reflect on what had happened and how it could have been prevented. The case of Maha Li Hobbs, though tragic, had ignited a movement, one that urged the public and officials alike to do more for those who are most vulnerable. And for Maha Li, it was a small but significant form of justice. Her story had forced the world to confront a devastating reality and, in doing so, had inspired a call to action. As the dust settles from the case of Maha Li Hobbs, we are left with a lingering question. How could this have been prevented? The answer is complex, yet it highlights the undeniable importance of child welfare systems, safe haven laws, and the unwavering need for a strong support network for vulnerable families. Safe haven laws exist across the United States to provide parents with an alternative to abandoning their children. These laws allow a parent to surrender their child at a hospital, fire station, or other designated safe location without facing criminal charges, as long as the child is unharmed. These laws are a lifeline for those who, for whatever reason, cannot care for their children but do not want to harm them. They are meant to prevent tragedies like the one we saw with Maha Li. Tragically, Alexus Tanielle Nelson chose not to take this route, opting instead to take her daughter's life. Legal adoption is another avenue that could have saved this child. There are countless organizations, legal procedures, and adoption agencies dedicated to making sure children who are no longer wanted or cared for are placed in safe and loving homes. In this case, Alexus falsely claimed that her daughter had been adopted, weaving a dangerous lie to cover up her own actions. The question is, why does she feel so hopeless that she couldn't utilize these resources? And why were the red flags ignored for so long? In retrospect, it is clear that there were signs, warnings that were overlooked or not fully addressed. The alarming silence from Maha Li's mother, the unsettling text messages to her own mother, the suspicious claim of adoption. These were all pieces of a puzzle that, if pieced together sooner, could have raised alarm bells. Family members, community members, and law enforcement all had a role to play in catching these signals early. But despite these red flags, no one was able to intervene in time to save a child. It is a painful truth. Our systems are not always foolproof, and sometimes we fail to protect those who need it most. But what if we could do better? What if, as a society, we could be more vigilant, more proactive in our efforts to protect children? We need to ask ourselves how we can improve our child welfare systems, how we can better support struggling parents, and how we can detect the early signs of neglect or violence before it's too late. Maha Li Hobbs was more than just a tragic statistic. She was a child with a life ahead of her, with dreams and potential that were stolen far too early. As we reflect on her short life, we can't help but feel a profound sense of loss, not just for the little girl who never had a chance, but for the opportunities missed to save her. This case, devastating as it is, should serve as a catalyst for change. Let's never let another child slip through the cracks. Let's work to ensure that every child has access to the resources, the support, and the safety they deserve. If you believe in justice and truth and in protecting the voiceless, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Together, we can make a difference.